Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 153. Today's guest is Jennifer Baker. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. For today's episode, I'm pleased to welcome writer Jennifer Baker for a conversation about her debut YA novel, Forgive Me Not. Jennifer Baker was named the 2019 Publishers Weekly Star Watch Superstar because her varied work championing diversity in publishing has made her an indispensable fixture in the book business. Her YA novel, Forgive Me Not, published by Nancy Paulson Books, is a 2023 Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist and was included in New York Public Library's Best Books of 2023, Electric Literature's Best Novels of 2023, the Texas Library Association's 2024 Tejas Reading List, and the Black Caucus American Library Association's Best of the Best 2023 list. Jennifer is also the editor of Everyday People, The Color of Life, a short story anthology, published by Atria Books. She is a recipient of the 2017 NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellowship and a 2017 Queen's Council on the Arts New Work Grant, as well as the QCA Junior Board Artistic Excellence Award in Nonfiction. Her essay, What We Aren't, was also listed as a notable essay in the Best American Essays 2018. Her short story, The Pursuit of Happiness, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize for 2017 by Newtown Literary Journal and is featured in the anthology What God Is Honored Here. Jennifer has over 20 years' experience in book publishing in a range of roles, including editorial, production, and media, and is an instructor for Bay Path University's Creative Nonfiction MFA, as well as the creator and host of the podcast Minorities in Publishing, which was a 2018, 2019, and 2020 finalist for the Digital Book World Best Use of Podcasting in Book Marketing. She previously served as a contributing editor to Electric Literature. She occasionally freelances as a proofreader, copy editor, and development editor across genres and has written for various publications in print and online. Now, I've been a fan of Jennifer's podcast, Minorities in Publishing, for quite some time, and so when I saw that she had a YA novel coming out, I was immediately interested, and reading it did not disappoint. I found it both moving and really insightful. The story imagines a near-future New York where the criminal justice system has been quote-unquote reformed such that young people in the system can be put through a series of trials with a capital T instead of incarceration. The story follows Violetta Chen Samuels, a teenager and high school student who accidentally kills her little sister in a drunk driving accident, and the trials that she's put through to ostensibly rehabilitate her. It's a story that examines the ideas that we have as a society about punishment and forgiveness, about the American carceral system, and about family and love, and all of the intersecting systems that affect people that live under them, whether that's race or class or gender or whatever. All right. There are links in the show notes to purchase your own copy of Forgive Me Not, which was just recently released in paperback.
I'm good. I really enjoyed your
Q
book.
And Willow Books in
I hadn't actually read any of your fiction before, and I was so pleasantly surprised by this book.
As always,
and
though,
I found it really moving.
There's an independent bookstore in your community.
Sort of one of the places that I
recommend
wanted to get
supporting their
started
local business
with talking about this book.
All right,
is
let's get started.
This
Here's
book
my conversation with Jennifer Baker.
I think thematically you could describe it as being sort of an interrogation of the American carceral system, which is obviously like a hugely important topic. And I've been thinking about other books that I've read that are sort of on a similar topic. Like last year, for example, I read Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars, which is like a totally different book in style, in content, but it's a similar subject matter. And so one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading this book is what made you want to write this as a book centered on young people, as opposed to, sometimes when other people write about a topic like this, they're going to be looking more at adults. There's definitely things that like what Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah does that are really highlighting the brutality of the system. And that's something that feels like more appropriate for older characters. But here, that is still something that gets highlighted in your book as well, but it's done in a really different way. And I wanted to start with that. Why YA?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I haven't read Nana's book yet. So for me, I thought about this book. I mean, it's 2024. So it took me 8 years to write this book. I actually started it in 2014. And what came through very clearly were characters. So for me, fiction, it's twofold. Sometimes the story comes first, but sometimes the voice and or characters come first. And usually I do a better job of being able to fully articulate a story in the fiction realm when the voice and or character come first. So Violetta and Vincent, who are the people you hear from, it's Violetta's story, but Vincent is, to me, integral, and his perspective is very integral. They came first, very prominently, and the circumstances for Violetta came first, and the first 2 chapters and the very last chapter have always been the first 2 chapters and the last chapter since I started it. So I always knew where it began, and it was filling in all that stuff in the the sandwich of the bread between the bread of the book. So them being teens, I have to recognize that there are things that I want to engage with for teens and center teens so that they are having agency and autonomy, and that there's a level of brutality I could have done, but I didn't want to do.
Right.
And I think it allows you to look more at the scope of complicity and how people are complicit and how the system works in a very different way. And one of the things that I noticed about many wonderful books available for young readers, especially, is that they focus on young men of color, understandably, because the rates are, at least the available stats as of now, even though they may be 2 years old, I can't believe that they've changed that much, is that Black people are the most detained in the United States for male, female, and juveniles. In the United States, we're the most incarcerated, right? And so these characters are biracial. They're Black and Chinese, and also they still are children of color who are dealing in a society that they didn't really think was a problem. But then when you're mostly impacted, how does that change your mindset? And sometimes that's really what has to happen for you to become radicalized or politicized, is that it now affects you. And so that was part of the story. Whereas with other books and the more prominently known books, I think, especially for young readers, teens specifically, and that feature teen boys, is that it was a matter of, are they guilty or innocent? And then if you take the guilt or innocent out of the equation, can we focus a little bit more on the system and how it works? It's not that you're not looking at the system if you're thinking about guilt or innocence, but I think it dominates the story in a way of, well, where does humanity come into play? Full stop. And so that's part of it, is like, once I engage and I'm like, they're teens and they're coming from a very present teen perspective, then I need to focus on it in terms of what they're experiencing in the moment and look at the way the system works and how they're reacting to it and how it's affecting them and how it's affecting people around them. And I felt like that was a bigger story that I hadn't seen as much than what I've seen in the adult and or young adult children's space. But it's not to say that adult books or no books have done this. It's just I hadn't seen them do it as much. And I do think even in the adult space, sometimes they look at the law, like we might look at the lawyer's perspective. We might look at the effects of the family, but we still want to kind of get someone to a path of freedom, which makes sense. But again, how does that kind of divert attention from the way the system works? Or how does it bring in more attention? It's a question I have as a storyteller.
It's this question of like guilty or not guilty, I feel like is something that this book, I agree, it does it in a different kind of way than a lot of other stories, even, well-intentioned stories. Because like there's a line in your author's note where you're saying, would things be more fair if victims of said crimes could decide the fate of those shown to be guilty? And that shown to be guilty seems very loaded to me, right? Because on the one hand, not everyone who is incarcerated is guilty of anything. And this is something that, you mentioned this in your author's note as well. Like sometimes people are incarcerated because it's more convenient to think of them as guilty when they're not. But that the characters that we see, that we are introduced to who have been incarcerated here, obviously, the main character, Violetta, also the other girls that she's in with, like Eve, who cyberbullied a girl until, she hurt herself. Serena, who, did a lot of theft, I guess. And then Petra, who did kill someone, but killed her rapist, right? It's not really questioned in the story whether or not any of these girls actually did the thing that they're accused of. They did do these things, but the question isn't, are they guilty or innocent? The question is very clearly like, okay, so these people all did something that was something they shouldn't have done. They all did something that was hurtful and possibly, extremely, possibly irreparably harmful to somebody else. And what do we do about that now? I find this difference to be such an important difference and not really one that I don't know whether or not this is something that gets addressed in other stories. I do think that, for example, like in Nana's book, there is this to some degree, but I think that to a greater degree, the question is like whether or not this is even part of our discourse as a society. And I think to a large degree, it really isn't. So I think that's one of the things that I found so fascinating about this story. You know what I mean?
Yeah, thank you for that, because I wanted to have a different conversation. And just a little note for Petra, she impaired the guy. So he's kind of like in a coma or something. Okay. So he's just not able to be part of the process, but other people are for the claiming of what happens. And yeah, in this world, I also, when I go back to complicity of, now the people who are considered the victims of these crimes get to make that choice. And they can choose either someone gets incarcerated, they can choose to forgive them and they get released, or they can choose that you enter the trials, which is a form of rehabilitation, which is what Violetta goes through. And her family is at the helm because Violetta gets into a DUI, drinking under the influence, and she's a young drinker. She has a permit, so she shouldn't be driving, and she certainly shouldn't be drinking. And that unfortunately leads to the death of her younger sister. And so her family is brought in, and Vince, that's where Vince's perspective comes into play. And so having those two perspectives allows you to see what Violetta goes through while in detention. But then you have Vince, who's witnessing how the system works, right? Seeing how people from the Department of Corrections are talking to his family, his parents, namely, and telling them, steering them in a direction and utilizing their vulnerability and their intense grief to get a certain outcome. And those are the bigger questions as I was writing, where it's like, okay, so why would they make this decision? And the parents were just angry in early drafts. They were just angry at their daughter. And so I really had to soften them to show that they really did love Violetta. They thought they were doing what was right, that they were confused, but that also the system didn't really change. And that the way we look at carceral systems in general as people can be very binary. Right? Like you did something, so you should be, but you're not thinking about circumstances. We're not thinking about X, Y, Z. And I'm kind of generalizing here when I say we, right? Like royal we. Mm-hmm. But this family is part of that. This family is part of the fact that it's like, we didn't think about this until it happened, and now it happened, and we think you need to be fixed because this is what the system is telling us, and this is how we've been raised to believe that this is what it is. And so I want folks to come out of this book questioning that. And so I really appreciate that's how you read it, because I just wanted to have a different kind of pathway to get to a level of decision making for the reader, whether you're an adult or whether you're a young adult. But because they're teens, they have even less ability to really make a change, not no ability to make change. Young people can absolutely make change, but they don't get to vote. Right? Mm-hmm. Like these kids don't get to vote. They don't get to like check off boxes. They don't get to, do a lot of things. These adults are making these decisions for them. And so how do you get a teenager by the end of this book to get to a full place of autonomy if they weren't at the beginning of the book? And I think that's hard to do no matter what age group you're writing for. But it's particularly to me, I really wanted to honor where the young folks were at and have a deep discussion, because I know that they're ready for deep discussions like this.
I feel like this thing about, what you were describing, the way the adjudicator in the story, a form of coercion that seems kind of insidious because it doesn't seem like outright coercion, and yet there is a very strong suggestion, a sort of manipulation that happens of the parents in this situation to bring them to this point where they're able to decide that this is something that their child needs to go through. There's a bunch of things here. Like, first of all, that this system, which is different from the system that we have now, at least in its outer trappings, is something that it's presented as having been intended to be a reform, is something that, we have the case of this character, Levon Harris, who was sentenced to life in prison for a very similar thing to what happened with Violetta. And that was something that sparked the kind of outrage that people were saying, this isn't fair that he should go away for his whole life. And so something needs to change. And what it sort of brings to mind to me is how even something that is intended to be a reform, is intended to make something better, can be subverted. I think about things like the the doctrine of qualified immunity, where this only comes up as a response to people made changes to the law to make it so that, police officers are supposed to be able to be held liable for things that they do. And yet then this thing comes up where now we have this doctrine that even though the statute as written says they are supposed to be held liable, the way that it's interpreted means that they still can't be held liable in almost every circumstance. And so it makes it, there's a way that can feel kind of hopeless, right? And here with Violetta, how awful would it be to be in a situation where you did something and it killed somebody that you love? It seems like that's punishment enough, and yet she still ends up having to go through this thing. I don't know. The whole thing was just really, I feel like there is a way in which you can read a story like this and be frustrated by it, by the way that even if we try to make something change, it still ends up being subverted. But I don't walk away from a story feeling frustrated exactly. And I'm not entirely sure how you pulled that off,
Thank you. I you live with something for so many years, you're like, I don't know anymore. Just take it. Like, this is as good as it's getting. I just don't know. But it's, because it's been out for a few months now. So I think I've had the opportunity to hear from people who, some are frustrated, some prefer one character over the other. Everyone gets it though. So that's my main takeaway, is that people get what I'm doing, whether it's for them or not. And I think at the end of the day, I just wanted Violetta specifically, not to say Vince doesn't matter, he does, but I knew his arc a lot clearer. Like I said, this is where he goes and I need to get him there. And I know where to get. But Violetta, it was there. I always tell people there was this, the arc, the story arc, rising action, falling action. And at a certain point, Violetta was falling off a cliff because I didn't know how to get her to make the choice that she does and to recognize she deserves what she does. Right. And so even in the mode of storytelling, I'm looking at the fact that she is in a space where she can absolutely deal with doom and gloom every day, all day, right? And again, I will be reading Nana's book, but I don't know how he deals with the light and the darkness in terms of spirituality, emotion, psychology and whatnot. And I think again, when you write for adults, sometimes you might go heavy, you might go hard. Whereas with young readers, we can still do that, but you might take a softer hand. And for me, the biggest thing was she still had to be loved throughout this. It had to come from a place of love. So even the young women she deals with in the book, there's no catfighting, right? There's no girl on girl violence. There's no big fights in the detention center. I mean, this isn't so much a spoiler, but that community is strong that she has in the detention center. And she being Violetta notes how people are being broken down. And so what's the point of even adding in that they're going after each other, even though that can be true about systems like this and spaces like this? We know it is true. but that these are all people, and these are all young women, and most of them are young women of color. And then you have a person like Callie, who is Violetta's best friend, and she's coming into it and saying, but I know you made a mistake, but I know you, and I know this isn't all there is to you. And so she is getting some level of reinforcement that she is a person and deserves to be treated as such. And then you have the other folks questioning, being like, we care about Violetta, but we're angry at her, which is valid, and we want to help her, and we don't know how. But we're believing the system will show us how to help her. And so those are different kind of ways to juggle so that Violetta is still being taken care of, even though she's going through a lot of heavy stuff. And that's kind of what I pay attention to as a storyteller, regardless of audience, but especially when you want to have this message that you have without being messagey. Like, it really is about the characters and the pacing and the plot and the overall structure and how it reads. But there had to be love at the center of it. And so I believe maybe that helps, that if you do get to the end and you do feel like, okay, I see where this is going and it's making me think things and it's making me feel things, that you're coming out of it recognizing that she got to a place that she needed to get to, and it's maybe better, it's maybe not better, but she got to a place where she's gone through it and understands more about who she is, and other people do too by the end of the book.
I feel like throughout this book, the characters all make sense in their motivations, right? That even some of the characters who are kind of antagonistic, that you have a sense of who they are and why they are the way that they are. Not all of them are ones where we get like a backstory necessarily, or not all of them are even I don't get the sense that, for example, we're supposed to empathize with the judicator, for example, but, or particularly with like the counselor. And yet I still get the sense of some of these characters of who they are as a person, why they are the way that they are, in a way that doesn't excuse them for the things that they do that wind up either in those characters' cases, you know, upholding this unjust system and doing so from a place of, especially in the judicator's place, doing it from a place of like extreme condescension to the people that he's interacting with. I feel like it's kind of fascinating to me because a lot of times I think in fiction, I feel like that there is a way in which understanding why a character does the things that they do, if that's something that the story gives you, it winds up being a way of sort of excusing or condoning what the characters do and making things sort of morally ambiguous. Whereas here I don't feel that at all, where the story can have an opinion about, you know, what all of these characters are doing, who they are, why they're doing them, in a way that where there is sort of a judgment being made, but not in a way that feels didactic. And I kind of wonder if maybe part of this, it just has to do with the fact that it's told in first person, but I sort of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because some people just really hate Randall. He's the judicator. And some people are like, F that guy. And I'm like, valid. And I'm also like, he's doing his job. Like, I know Randalls. You know what I mean? Whether they work in a penitentiary or they work in a corporate environment, I know that I have worked alongside that person who will do whatever it takes to do their job. Whether it means throwing people under the bus, whether it means, you know, screwing over other people, there are folks who will do whatever they need to do for the job. And I understand that person. And that's how I saw him. And to an extent, Counselor Susan too, is these folks are here to do their job. And there is a point where I think with folks like that, particularly, you just have to shut something off emotionally, right? Like, how do you go to certain spaces and be your full self? If you've been told this is what this is, if you've been told people deserve to be incarcerated, if you've been told everything we are doing is the right thing, like you said, it's a form of quote unquote reform, what they go through now. And some of it is based on real people. Like Levon is kind of Khalif Browder / Lionel Tate mostly, for people who want to Google that. I've talked a little bit about him. And I usually present and talk about Lionel a bit more when I talk to teens and whatnot. So there are folks who just do it. They will strike you down. It's like we've seen the video, and you're like, how can people treat people like this? This is their job. They've been trained to do a job. They're shutting something off and believe in this job wholeheartedly. And so I think as an author, I can't come in judging the characters I'm writing. This can also be because I've been in therapy for like 10 plus years. But I am coming into it definitely as a storyteller of like, I'm not judging any of you, but I need to provide the reasoning for the reader. And I need to know the reasoning. So even if I'm not giving a whole scene or a whole background, I need to know your reasoning for this so that I can portray you as someone fully flesh, even if you're a tertiary character. Because even those characters fulfill a role, but they have a personality, they have a background. So that's kind of how I approach it, is without judgment, but with understanding. But that doesn't mean I agree with the decision making at all. Because I'm an abolitionist, so I was like, over time of like really reading and understanding and researching for a book like this, you're like, why was I not an abolitionist from the start? I don't understand. But then you do understand, because it's like the level of ignorance you have, the complicity, which comes through in the book even more. Like my own complicity comes through in this book in ways through characters. And it's not necessarily me trying to explore my it's exploring it from a like humanity perspective, from this universal way of like, why do these things still exist? And I can't provide a solution, because the solution to me is the whole thing gets obliterated. That's the solution to me. So then what is the book about? And it has to be, to me, that you recognize that these folks understand that the system is not right, and that something different happens after you close the book. Like I foresee what happens to these characters. I'm not writing a sequel, just FYI. Even though folks have asked me if I will, I'm like, no, my second book under contract will not be a sequel for this. I'm donesies. But I know what happens to these characters after.
One of the things that I sort of wanted to talk about is, looking at this family, the Chen Samuels family. Something that I thought was kind of interesting is that this is not a family that's in poverty, right? They're not an affluent family by any means, but they're also not particularly poor either. They're sort of a working class family. Dad is an electrician and mom works at a city college, I think in admin, probably. They don't seem to necessarily, or at least in the lead up to this novel, they don't seem to be struggling exactly, but they're also not, like they have enough to eat out sometimes. Vince has his own car that was a gift from his parents, and it's not a really nice car, but it's still a car, and it's something that he appreciates. On the other hand, the fact that when we compare, or we see how Vince looks at a character like Ross, who is wealthy, and, he's got the nice Mustang, he's got the Nikes. There's some envy that happens there. We also see at one point the mom sort of stressing over unpaid bills that sort of have piled up since the accident. And it's just interesting to me to have this character situated, or this family situated this way. Because I feel like a lot of times when we're shown stories about families, especially Black families, interacting with the criminal justice system, that they are sort of, more often, they're going to be either below the poverty line or closer to it. I feel like this family, they're not so set that having a shock to their system like this event isn't going to have consequences where perhaps they're going to have to worry about things. But they're not so precarious that they're wondering where they're going to live either. And I thought this was an interesting choice. I wanted to sort of, is this something that was just like you knew who these characters were at the start, or was it a choice to sort of situate them here in this sort of socioeconomic level?
Yeah, I relate to that because I grew up with that. I mean, I'm not rich. I guess I would be considered middle class now, depending on what those numbers look like. But I definitely had food insecurity. My mom was not always employed. There was a period when my mom and I didn't live together. She had to live in Brooklyn, and I had stayed with a friend of hers in Queens so that I could still go to high school in Queens. So you don't forget that stuff. I guess maybe some people do if, you kind of really extract yourself or, disassociate. I do not. So I just remember very acutely what that was like as a teenager. And I think most stories that I write for any audience, especially in fiction, is usually writing people who aren't well off financially or who know people who are well off financially, but maybe the main characters aren't, or they're trying to get to that place. And why? Why would you want to get to that place? Like, what in your mind makes you feel like that will solve all your problems? But class is definitely a big thing that I think should be talked about and understood how it impacts folks at all ages and all backgrounds. And I when I write about those who don't have money, I usually don't go to a level of like really distinct poverty, not because I don't want to, but because I think, again, growing up images with Black people, I saw a lot of destitution, and I don't necessarily want to add to that pile. And also, if you think of a book like Precious or, and the book that followed, when they're talking about cockroaches and things piling up and, just the level of it. And I wanted to depict a family that has it okay, but at any given moment, there's this big thing that can just shake their world up. And then you have one of Vince's friends who deals with it even worse financially. And then you have, like you said, Ross, who comes from a very affluent family, but is very lonely. So it has its downsides for him. So no one's in this place of, it's all good. Everything's great. Everything's great. Like they have various problems and they may weigh on them. And also for the family, I think it also helps in terms of the story, right? Is that the pressure the kids might feel of, well, I have to do well because we don't have everything. Like we got it okay, but Vince needs to be a superstar because he's feeling this pressure because he does something well, and that the way he does it well can be monetized to help him go to college. And that can help his family and alleviate some burdens that people openly talk about and which weighs on him. And which I knew that I couldn't go to college without a scholarship. Like I probably could have and come out with a lot of debt, but I didn't want to. Like I saw how much debt impacted my family for various reasons. So I didn't want to. So I was very good at school, but I liked school. And I had to get a full scholarship to go to college, and then came out of undergrad with no debt, which is a privilege. Like, that's a very big privilege if you're in New York City and to be able to go to college clean slate. I don't take that for granted. And so again, when you just remember these things, you can kind of imbue your characters in their lives with this reality rather than like, I wonder what that's like. I wonder what that's like. It's like, no. I know what it's like not to eat. Yeah. I know what it's like to be worried if the rent will be paid. I know what it's like for me to have $100, and that is the $100 me and my mom just have until the next welfare check comes in. Yeah, and I just remember that very keenly, and I wanted to depict it in a real way, but it is also a circumstance in which some people can get into the situations they're in.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to just talk about a little bit before we wrap up the first segment is one of the things that really stood out to me about this book. And I hope this isn't a spoiler. I don't think that it is, but sort of late in the book, Vince also gets arrested. And yet the way that the family responds to that is really different from how they respond to Violetta being arrested. And in particular, the way that I actually wrote this down, that the mom, when she's meeting him after his arrest, she says, "It's okay, you're a good kid, this is all a mistake," which is not what ends up happening at the beginning of the book. And to me, it was such a stark thing that for me, I mean, I think there's different ways to interpret this, right? Like maybe the fact that they've just come through this harrowing experience as a family with their other child is going to predispose them to work through this one differently. That's definitely something that I feel is there. But also the fact that Vince throughout the book has been called the golden boy of the family. It also makes sense to me that they would react differently to the way that their golden boy versus their sort of, problem child or invisible middle child screws up. And just overall, the fact that our society treats different people differently. Like the whole idea of the rule of law is that everybody is supposed to be judged equally under the law. And of course, we know that that is a fantasy at best, that is just not how the world works. But even here, where it's not the law, it's within this family that these two characters are treated differently, was just so stark to me. And I wanted to sort of see what we could tease out about that.
Thank you for noticing that. I'm not sure if people don't notice it, but I haven't gotten to talk about it as much, because when I talk about misogyny, that's kind of what I'm talking about. When I say, oh yeah, this book has misogyny, and people are like, oh, where? And I'm just like, I'm like, well, did you notice how he's treated versus Violetta? And again, when you focus on a young woman and a brown young woman versus a man, we have to acknowledge that there's this way that she's not being treated the same. And that, again, was always part of the book. Again, like those, I guess the last two chapters, I guess, were the first two and the last two were ones I had written and pretty much stayed the same. And that there's a level of acknowledgement of, well, why? Do y'all not see this? And yeah, you can say, well, these are two very different circumstances. And they are, the end result for both of for each of what they did, right? Mm-hmm. For what happens with Vince, for his reasoning, and for why Violetta's in there, very different reasons. And I acknowledge and understand that. But you cannot deny that the treatment is different. And that treatment signifies an issue that was a seed that sprouted that led to things. So there's culpability too, right? Like I'm not blaming the parents, right? But there's culpability here. And because I would never sit there and be like, oh, your kid's this because of you. I know that's not an okay thing to say, even though there are circumstances where maybe it is very, very accurate, but for these parents, it's like in the elevation of their son, in the acknowledgement, like in the letters, which were crucial and very, that was like the last point for me to really tie things together for Violetta's story, was Violetta needed to kind of psych herself up and be like, I remember these things and I understand why I felt this way now, where I never could have articulated it. And when she says in one of the letters, right, when people say these things about you, when people say you're just sensitive, when people say pipe down, when they don't say that to your siblings, but they say it to you, it shrinks you. It does something to you. And she has the foresight and the time now to recognize that these things did something to her that led her to like kind of act out in a way. But maybe she would have acted out anyway. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we have to look at that's part of it, I think. And the parents, I think, needed to listen to her in a way that they weren't listening to her or Vincent, so that they recognized all the kids were dealing with stuff and that they weren't exactly the most approachable people.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for the first segment. But so why don't we take a little break and then come back and do the second segment?
Awesome.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I was mentioning earlier about the inspiration I get a lot from other mediums. Mm-hmm. And I think especially storytelling through visual mediums. So I'd love to talk about that, especially in terms of TV series or movies and whatnot, like how those can really help. And maybe that's helpful for folks who are listening from a craft perspective, because sometimes I talk about that when I teach.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, you know, I feel like in a lot of ways that different narrative media, they work in really different ways. And so there are definitely things that we can learn from other art forms for sure. And like even beyond narrative media, it's something like, you know, paintings or poetry or whatever, right? There are definitely things that we can learn from that and take to incorporate into our own craft. But they're also like the way a TV series works, even though it in many ways, you know, is still a narrative form that is involves writing and involves dialogue and scene setting and all of these things. It still works in a really different way from the way a book works. And, you know, like I'm not a published fiction writer by any means, but so I'm interested to know how someone like you thinks about that, both commonality, but also difference in how you work with that, you know?
Right. Because I feel like some of the commentary I've gotten, whether it's been a critique or a form of praise, is that I tend to be a bit cinematic. So I do scenes a lot because I kind of see things in scenes, especially in fiction and even in nonfiction. Sometimes I will paint a scene and get into like the exposition or discourse. But in a book like Forgive Me Not, I do tend to have a lot of scenes, and I like that. Mm-hmm. Because I want you to like really see and be in the body of someone, especially depending on the point of view. And a book that, like, not a book, sorry, but a series that helped me because I was revising, and I revised about 40%, maybe more of the book in 2021, 2022. Yeah, 2021, I think, when I did a big chunk of revision. And I was watching Squid Game.
Oh.
Yes, it's so good.
I still haven't seen that.
Oh my God, it's so good. But I also understand if you hesitated because the hype, because sometimes when things are overhyped, I'm like,
well, no. For me, it was actually more just that, like, I didn't know if I was in the right headspace for something quite that heavy, you know? I keep meaning to watch it. I just haven't gotten around to it.
It's really good, but I also understand because it was 2021.
Yeah.
So, it was 2021. So we were just getting these vaccines and whatnot. So it was a time, not that the pandemic is over, but it definitely had a different energy, so to speak. And so there's this thing with, and I'm not really spoiling it, I hope, because these are the first 2 episodes of the series.
Sure.
So the first episode, you get introduced to everybody, and then they get taken. They get, you know, they're like, hey, we're going to blindfold you, mask you, kind of knock you out, drug you, and take you to this random place. And you're going to be in this kind of dungeony space where it's a huge, massive dorm room. And y'all are going to compete for a lot of money, a lot of money. And the last ones left standing get to split the cash. And so they have the first challenge. And the first challenge, for those who may have seen it, or even if you just saw commercials, you see this big doll that's like singing, and it's kind of creepy, and it starts shooting people. I mean, it's more to it than that in terms of the game itself. It's like ollie, ollie, ollie. I think it's green light, red light, 1, 2, 3, I think. So whenever you turn around and you see everyone has to stop, and if anyone doesn't stop, they get shot. And so they go through this thing, and after that, whoever runs this whole game basically says, hey, you can leave though. They said, you all have to vote. So it's a majority vote. And so people are like, we got to get out of here. Like, we got to go. And so the majority vote is to go back. And so some people did not. Like, it was a kind of close, somewhat close. Maybe it wasn't super close, but there was a good chunk of people who were like, no, we want to stay. This money is important. And so you go back, everyone goes back. They're like, nope, majority said it, everyone has to go back. No one stays. And so then you follow some of the people you've met, and then you see some folks decide to go back. And it's not the same number of people as the original number, but there are people who are like, I am in a very destitute situation and I'm going back. And what I really liked about that was that it showed you what the stakes were that would make people return to this situation. It wasn't just so we're going to kill some people in this first challenge and everyone's just going to be like, okay, I'm in it. It showed you like what level of desperation will make people go to this. And then you follow, and then you just see how the series transpires. Because now at this point, everyone knows it's like life or death at this point. And they understand what they're getting into. And again, just from a storytelling perspective, I'm like, you set up a question I'm never going to ask about your series by allowing me to understand risk and circumstance. And whether the people in the writers' room said, you know what, we need to set this up in a way so that people don't have questions, or whether someone said, like, this is just how we started, or da-da-da-da-da, I don't know. I wasn't there. But again, just from a storytelling mode, I was just like, man, this is like really, really smart. Like, this is like really, really great, because now I'm not going to ask this question. And I think about this a lot, like, especially with writing Forgive Me Not, or, you know, the books and stories I'm writing now, fiction, fiction primarily, not so much nonfiction, is what questions do I not want you to have? So that you can just enjoy this read. You can just enjoy this experience. Because even folks like Jordan Peele have said, you know, if a person comes into your movie, especially if it's a horror movie, being like, why didn't you do this? It ruins the whole thing. Because they'll just be sitting there like, you're dumb. You're dumb. You're in this situation because you're dumb. And he's like, if you have people acknowledge the ridiculousness of something, if you have people confront the issue, if you have certain things where it just takes away this question, then someone can ease into the story and trust you, because they're not sitting there being like, well, why didn't you think of this? And so that's a juggle a lot for storytellers in general. And I think with visual modes, maybe sometimes you have the visual, right, that can help you do that in a way that writers who are just relying on text are building that in your mind. But I think it really helps to kind of think about how you approach story.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're really talking about here is defining what the stakes are for the characters and understanding what the characters' motivations are at a fundamental level. And I think whether you're talking about film or television or novels or short stories or whatever, those are sort of questions that you need to understand as both the author and as the audience, that if you don't understand what would make a person, you know, however they find themselves in a situation, there's something about that character that makes them respond to that situation in the way that they do. And that has to feel real. It has to feel organic.
Right.
One of the things that I often think about is that one of the huge limitations you mentioned, you know, in film and television, you have that visual element to help explain things to you that you don't have in text. Mm-hmm. But what text does offer, especially I think when you're writing in first person, the way that Forgive Me Not is in first person, right? Is that you have a much easier access to the characters, to the point of view characters' interiority. And that's something that's much more difficult to convey, I think, in film and television without doing something really kind of clumsy, like having a voiceover.
I hate a voiceover.
I mean, you know, there are times when it's okay to have a voiceover, but for the most part, it just ends up feeling really kind of ham-fisted. So then you have to rely on, you know, camera angles or on the performance to sort of imply what the character is thinking or feeling. And a good filmmaker and a good actor can do that for you, can still get the audience there. But I feel like it's a bigger leap. Whereas in written stories, you can just show people exactly what's happening on the inside. And that's something that it's such a big difference between the two forms that I don't know, it's something that I just find interesting to think about, you know?
Yeah. I think also I think about it a lot because my mom loves books and she loves theater. So I love a lot of the things my mom loves. And I used to want to adapt. I mean, I might still want to do that. I don't know. But I used to want to adapt books into film. I was thinking, oh, that'll be my job. And it was not. But so sometimes I think about that. Like I look at a Brokeback Mountain because I love that story. And it's not a super short story either. It's not like, oh, it's a 2,000. No, it is not. It is more than 10,000 words, I'm pretty sure. And look at the movie. Holy crap. That movie really captures that story. But the fact that that story is a rich story and it is a short story and they give that equal level of depth in the movie, I was just like, what? I literally looked at both and was like, how? And obviously the performances do it, but like you said, you have more of the interiority in the story itself. But when you have those moments where you see the longing and the quietness and the, you know, and just those moments of peace and what's unsaid in the movie accounts for a lot of that interiority that we have in the book. But also these characters were like the character of, I love Heath's character. I forget his name too. But Heath's character in the movie that's in the story, he's really quiet in the story. He's a really, really quiet dude. And you have to carry that. So what does all that silence mean? But it's so powerful too. Like his silences are so powerful on and off the page. And so when you just see how someone translated that, it was really quite amazing to just see, because I was like, whoa, and learn from. I love Annie Proulx. Annie Proulx is one of my favorite short story writers. And it was just like, wow.
I've never read the story.
It's one of my favorite short stories, even though it is not super short. Some people might argue and be like, it's not a short story if it's more than 10,000 words. And I would argue back. I think it is.
I mean, I've heard people call it a novella before. I think in some ways that's, you know, getting a little nitpicky. I think what's interesting, you know, I mean, I loved that movie. I haven't seen it in a while, but the way you're describing it is bringing back a lot of memories for me. And it's interesting. I think that one of the things that films can do, and that good stories can do, good written stories can do, is that you can have the sense both at the same time of you being a spectator of seeing things from the outside of the story, but also identifying with the character. And I feel like a character like Ennis, Heath Ledger's character.
Thank you. Because I was like, I have a friend with that name. Like,
yeah, he is such a quiet character, and particularly in that movie, the way that the cinematography works, especially in the early parts of the movie, providing you all of that space and the landscape, that you're, as the viewer, able to see the same things that Ennis is seeing when he's out in the world, provides you this way of that you're not just seeing him, but you're kind of seeing through his eyes.
Right.
That's something that I think that it's difficult to do in film. It's also difficult to do in text, but I kind of feel like they're difficult in different ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
It's
because he has that whole thing he's wrestling with when he realizes he realizes about his desire and his sexuality and his fear and how much that has overtaken him his whole life. You know, and that to me was really, really heavy.
Yeah.
To try to, how do you convey that? How do you say it and not say it? Because that's part of it, right? Is there's a lot that isn't specifically said in the story and in the movie.
Yeah. I think about this in my own work a lot because, you know, the writing that I have done has most often been either personal essay or poetry. And in visual art, I'm primarily a photographer. Something that a lot of people talk about, a lot of photographers, let's say, talk about is an image, a photograph being poetic. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how poetry and photography are similar and different. And I think one thing that both poetry and photography have the ability to do that is very different from how prose fiction works is that I feel like the most powerful experiences I have with both of those are when because like a poem, a really great poem often doesn't just come out and say what it means. It's not really,
Exactly.
You still get where it's going, but it is coming at it from a different angle. And I think that the best photographs are ones too, where what the photograph is about, what the image is about is not exactly what's in the image, but rather what's evoked by the image, which requires the reader or the audience to meet you there in a way, right? It requires a certain amount of work on the part of the audience. And I think that a lot of times with prose fiction, there can be an impulse to over-explain, maybe not trusting the reader to get you there, because you have the ability to explain. And yet oftentimes a lot of the really powerful moments, especially I feel like with short fiction, are the ones where it's not exactly what's said, but it's what's unsaid but implied, and that the reader has to meet you there, can be really, really potent moments,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm such an admirer of poetry and photography, and when you are kindly share your photography online too, because it's funny because you, Rachel Eliza Griffith, and Nicholas Nichols are all folks who do poetry and do photography, and you all have very different modes. Like if you look at each of your photographs side by side, it's like very different what y'all's are doing. Through those visual mediums. And I think prose is about that. It's about telling a story. It's about entertainment. It's about education. It's about multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
Like with Forgive Me Not, I don't want to just sit here and be like, I want you to learn something. Yeah, it's like, Ty, do you want to learn something? Like maybe, like, I don't know, but this is fiction and I want to have a viewpoint, but also again, not judge the characters and to present this to you so that you can take what you will. And I think all good modes do that. And I think sometimes maybe photography allows that in a lot of ways. Like I know there can be the, Photoshop and, layers and filters and stuff like that amplify this or kind of dull this or kind of do this to create something. But it's still kind of in search of invoking something where, to your point, I do think prose writers, we might be told or we may not trust ourselves. And that's why I look to other mediums like film, which can be too long. There are movies that are too damn long. Like I'll talk to friends. I'll be like, that was 3 hours. That could have been 2, and there are books you read where you're like, that was 400 pages and it could have been 284, where some media just do that. And so sometimes going to a museum where you just experience something in real life, in the media, you're like, oh, this is lovely. And I don't get any of that outside noise. You might get that little descriptor of like, this was the intent or this is who the creator was and such. I love Titus Kafar's work. I don't know if you know his stuff. Titus Kafar, Khar.
I don't think so.
And he does these amazing things where he would do these paintings of quote unquote founding fathers. Of course, they're not colonizers. And he would, take an X-Acto knife and cut open, and then behind the image, so you might have a silhouette of like old white dude, but you'd have a black woman behind that. And he's like showing the impact of imperialism and colonization and enslavement. And he's using the visual medium to show the ways that whiteness has covered up, erased, tried to hide what they have done to black folks, namely black women, and some of the ones that touch me the most. and the ways that they deserve to be prominent in this history and in the way that we look at these folks' stories. And so that's a media where I'm like, damn. Like, if you just look at how he does, like, some of it'll be hanging off. And then, but behind is like this very, very beautiful, full color image of like an enslaved woman in cloth and like looking over her shoulder, or maybe it's her body and then it's the mixture, but he's not using chains. He's not using this. Sometimes he might have, kind of strips where it might be blood or torn or something like that. But he uses that in a very, I'm just like, how do you even come up with that? Because when you see it, if you Google his stuff and look at it, you'll be like, whoa.
I will have to do that.
Yeah.
By the way, I wanted to say thank you for putting me in the same sentence with these other artists. That's very kind of you. I think, one of the things I think, and this is true whether almost regardless of what the art form or the medium is I feel like the audiences can tell when the artist is trying too hard, that, whether it's a prose writer who is over explaining, making things too long, or not allowing you to come away with what is in the story, but they want to tell you, like, this is what the story is about, and this is what you're supposed to take away from it, and this is the good guy, and this is the bad guy. Like, that's where it's really overdetermined like that. Or, a photographer who's just really underlining the point too much, or a poet who, isn't relying enough on metaphor to get you there, but just has to really, punch things home too much. I feel like audiences see that, and that those are the ones where you don't come away feeling like you as the reader or the watcher or the listener are having an authentic experience. And it's, like, for example, in your book, I feel like what we were talking about before, that, you've described, you're not judging the characters. I feel like the book is not written in such a way where the author's hand is in there and saying, this is the way you should feel about this character. But you are setting things up in such a way that, like, even if, a character like Randall the Adjudicator, we can have some sense of who that guy is, and maybe that you as the author are not presenting him with a judgment. But I think it's going to be pretty rare that a reader is going to come away from this book thinking like, yeah, that Randall, he's a great guy, or that you're going to come away from this book feeling like, yeah, this system that's been set up makes total sense, right? Maybe this is like a one bad situation, but it's just a one bad apple thing, and we can't. No, you're going to come away from this story, if you've been paying any amount of attention to it at all, you're going to come away from the story with a sense of the injustice of this situation, and that is something that I feel like that you have to be able to trust your audience to get there on their own, right? And that I think is really sort of what I was saying about, that it's, whether you're talking about a poem or a photograph or a short story or a novel or a movie or a TV show, it's really allowing the audience to come to you that winds up having that authentic experience. At least for me, that's what I think.
Yeah, I feel similarly. And you have to kind of learn that too in your own method of self-editing, if you're not necessarily always getting that feedback in the critique, because it really is. It's like, well, what are you trying to say here?
Mm-hmm.
And are you being didactic? Are you being heavy-handed? Are you forcing it? Because again, in fiction, it's like you said, these characters are in first person. There are things they're not going to say inside their head.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not. And so what is the emotional reaction, and what is propelling that reaction for them to react to do what they do, the reasoning for that. And I think sometimes, when you have third person, you have to approach it differently, because maybe you are in that character's head. In second person, you are, but you're saying it a different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fourth person, you're using the we, so it's collective, potentially. or it's one person speaking for the collective, all that stuff, you know?
Mm.
So it's hard because it's something I edit for when I edit myself and when I work with others as a teacher or as an editor. But sometimes it really is looking at the page and saying, what are you doing here? Like circling that passage and like, do you not think that the passage before did what this passage is doing here?
Mm.
Do you think this is hitting it home again? Do you think you're saying the same thing? Because I had to look at that with Vincent too. I would have him running away from things a lot.
Mm.
And so then I'm like, okay, so is this just who he is? Or did I just run out of ways to say that he runs out of stuff? Or do I just need two ways, you know, or can I have him running towards something in a positive way and away from something in a negative way? And so that's the self-editing process and then he acknowledges it. And at a certain point, I'm like, let me just have him acknowledge that he runs away from things instead of keep having him run away from things, you know, just have like two particular moments, like he's a track runner. So yes, he runs. He's good at this. It's symbolic, but it's also literal. He runs away from his problems. But am I overusing this as a way to do it? And also in the overuse, can I reduce that and acknowledge it?
Yeah.
That he's like, I am aware of what I do.
Yeah.
And what does that do? How does that help the story or not help the story, you know? And so those are the questions. I'm super analytical in the way I write, but there's also a big freedom in, for me, the writing. The analytical nature comes in the revision for me.
I think that kind of thing is really important. I think that for the reader, for me as a reader, what really matters in a situation like that is not just like, is this sort of an overused thing that this person is doing, but it's like, does this feel authentic to what this character would do? You know, does this, and even having the realization, confronting this thing head on, you know, acknowledging, yes, this is the thing that I'm doing. Does that feel like an organic realization that character is having and would have at this moment in their life is, for me, what makes that feel alive rather than forced. You know what I mean?
Right. Because, I have to look at it both ways of what's organic to the character and also what am I overdoing that doesn't serve the plot.
Yeah.
And there's a lot I cut that didn't serve the plot. Sure. It was just, after a while, they're like, this is a cool scene, and it's like, that's valid, it may be entertaining, but it's not serving the plot.
Sure.
It's not moving the story forward, and it's not introducing anything new that is going to help the reader piece together what's happening. And so you're kind of juggling all of that. And that's when I look at, again, all these various ways of how to learn, tell story, have a message, have a sensibility, is, well, how did they do that? How did you get from A to B to C so that I remember A by the time we get to C? Because I needed to remember A by the time I get to C. How many times does someone need to say it to the point where it, to your point, is organic and not repetitive? And so I think a lot about that, of like, one time can be enough. Maybe you need to remind people twice. Maybe three times. But twice is usually the way to go in prose, especially if you're dealing with very short fiction. Like once has to be enough with very short fiction, but twice, maybe three times in a novel, maybe, but make that third time count if it needs to. Yeah. But I see that in film, like, not all films, but some films are just so repetitive. You're like, oh my God, this is so repetitive. Y'all just keep yelling at each other. Divorce each other. God. Like, leave, do whatever you need to do, but you obviously don't like each other. You know what I mean? But maybe it's supposed to do something, but maybe it's just for the level of, I want to perform in a way. And so, I look at the performances as well as the entirety of a series, of a movie, of a whatnot. And I do want to encapsulate these cinematic methods, but I also can enjoy it. So I do enjoy things, but I also learn from things. And I don't know if all people do that.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're like sitting at it and you can kind of compartmentalize of like, I'm enjoying this. And then, oh, snap, that was actually a really intuitive way to introduce conflict. Like, now that I think about it, that was a really good line that establishes this character's identity, who this character is and what they're about. You know?
I will say, in my experience, it's most often artists who are the ones who are able to notice craft as it's happening. But so the last question, the question I always like to wrap up with, is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity that you've experienced recently that meant something to you. We've mentioned a couple, but I wanted to see if there was something that you'd like to underline.
Yeah, I literally just finished Kelsey Norris's book. It's right behind me. I should have. It is called House Gone Quiet. It is a short story collection that came out in 2023. She's a debut in that regard. I love short story collections. Her writing is spectacular. It's spectacular. It's just, I'm still sitting with it because I literally finished it yesterday. But it is just really, really well written. I haven't gotten to read a story collection in a while because I acquired books for about 2 years. And you don't really, it's not that you don't, but to make time for pleasure reading is so hard when you're acquiring books. It's so hard. And I was revising my book in a big way around the same time. So it was just, so now that I work in nonprofit and teach, I have more time to read for pleasure. I don't know if you do. I know you're reading for the podcast, so sometimes that isn't pleasure. Because sometimes it's not always, sometimes it's like, this is work. I got to read this book by this time. And sometimes it's like, I read this book. I loved it. I want to talk to people. But yeah, I think if you want to add Kelsey, you and the listeners want to add Kelsey Norris's House Gone Quiet story collection. And it's a little over 200 pages. So it's not even like a thick story collection, and it's in paperback. So if you're, you don't want to pay that $30 and up price that we're seeing for hardcovers in the U.S., right up your alley. Get that paperback of Kelsey Norris's book, and just like kind of lose yourself in the stories. I'm still ruminating on a lot of them, but the writing, I just came away from every story like, woo, so well written. Oh, that description. Yes, Kelsey. Yes. That's the way to do it. Yes, I saw that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I love this combo. I'm so glad we got to talk again. And it's funny because when we did talk, I had gotten the pub deal. It looks like. Yeah, because the episode went up December 2020, but I think we talked at least a month or two before that. So I had probably gotten my deal for Forgive Me Not around that time. So it's kind of funny how that kind of comes full circle, and you're so kind to read it and read it so lovingly. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. All right. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes for you to buy your own copy of Forgive Me Not. There are also links to Jennifer's website, where you can find links to her other fiction and nonfiction writing, as well as to Jennifer's podcast, Minorities in Publishing. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please consider supporting the show by making a pledge at our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/likewisemedia, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that, and you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. That's all for now. We'll be back on September 25th with a conversation with poet Rachel Edelman about her 2023 poetry collection, Dear Memphis, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.